A 60-second television ad, that's all it took. 1 minute of a dead president's voice, carefully clipped and broadcast during baseball's biggest stage. And just like that, the entire framework of Canada-US trade negotiations collapsed overnight. Not because of a failed summit, not because of a diplomatic incident at the border, not because of a military standoff or a sanctions dispute. A TV ad and what followed left Washington, Ottawa, and every trade analyst watching this unfold genuinely stunned, not just by Trump's reaction, but by what Carney did next. Because what looked on the surface like a diplomatic crisis engineered by a rogue provincial premier turned out to be something far more calculated, far more layered, and far more consequential than anyone in Washington had anticipated. Let's go back to where this started, because context is everything here, and the context stretches back further than October 2025. When Mark Carney won Canada's federal election in April 2025, he didn't win on a platform of diplomacy and accommodation. He won on a platform of sovereignty. He told Canadians, explicitly and repeatedly, that the relationship with the United States had fundamentally changed, that the old model of deepening integration, tight military cooperation, and shared economic destiny was finished. The old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over, he said. These were not the words of a man planning to spend his tenure trying to please Washington. These were the words of a man who had already concluded that the terms of the relationship needed to be renegotiated from scratch, and that Canada needed leverage it had never bothered to build before. But Carney is also a pragmatist. A former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, a man who understands, better than almost anyone in Canadian politics, that economic transitions take time, that markets don't care about political declarations, and that more than 3/4 of Canada's exports flowing to a single partner means you cannot simply pivot overnight without inflicting serious damage on your own people. So Carney did something sophisticated. He pursued 2 tracks simultaneously. On one track, he maintained open lines to Washington, cultivated a personal rapport with Trump, visited the White House in early October, and kept trade negotiators at the table. On the other track, he was already laying the foundation for a Canada that doesn't depend on American goodwill to function. By October 2025, Canada and the United States were in the middle of what looked like a fragile but functioning trade dialogue. Carney had visited Trump at the White House on October 7th. There were handshakes, or talk of mutual love, and carefully worded optimism about restoring the kind of relationship that had defined North American commerce for decades. Trade negotiators from both sides were meeting in Washington. Progress, by all accounts, was being made. Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc described the talks as constructive, and his spokesperson confirmed just days before everything fell apart that the objective remained to build on the progress made until an agreement is reached in the best interests of Canadian workers and businesses. From the outside, it looked like 2 countries cautiously but genuinely trying to find their way back to stable ground. Then Doug Ford got creative. The Ontario Premier, a conservative, populist politician who doesn't even belong to Carney's Liberal Party, commissioned a television ad campaign targeting American audiences directly. Not Canadian audiences, American ones. The ad ran in 198 of the 210 U.S. media markets. It aired over 530 times in New York alone, nearly 280 times in Washington, D.C. Ontario spent more than $275,000 on the campaign. And the centerpiece of it? The voice of Ronald Reagan himself, taken from a 1987 radio address delivered from Camp David, in which the former president warned in plain language against the long-term dangers of tariffs. Reagan's own words, "When someone says, 'Let's impose tariffs on foreign imports,' it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs, and sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. But over the long run, Such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse. Businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs. It was a masterpiece of political judo. You can't accuse Reagan of being anti-American. You can't call his words fake. You can't dismiss the messenger without dismissing the godfather of modern American conservatism. And yet here was a foreign government using one of the most revered figures in Republican Party history to argue, in prime time, to directly against the sitting Republican president's signature economic policy. It was pointed. It was deliberate. And it was timed to air during the first games of the Major League Baseball World Series, one of the most watched television events in the United States, broadcast into living rooms in every corner of the country. Ford posted the ad himself on social media with the caption, "Using every tool we have, we'll never stop making the case against American tariffs on Canada. The way to prosperity is by working together." He wasn't hiding what he was doing, he was daring Washington to respond. Trump initially seemed almost amused. Earlier that same week, he had acknowledged seeing the ad. "If I was Canada, I'd take that same ad also," he told a gathering of Republican senators on Tuesday. He even added, "I do believe that everybody's too smart for that." It sounded like a man who had absorbed the punch and decided not to swing back. By Thursday night, everything had changed. In a late-night post on Truth Social, Trump declared, in all capital letters, that all trade negotiations with Canada were hereby terminated. "Tariffs are very important to the national security and economy of the USA. Based on their egregious behavior, all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated." He accused Canada of trying to illegally influence the United States Supreme Court, which was scheduled to hear oral arguments in early November on whether his sweeping reciprocal tariffs were a legal use of emergency powers granted by Congress. Trump claimed the ad was designed to sway that ruling. He accused Canada of having cheated and got caught. He did not specify which law had allegedly been broken. The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation piled on, saying Ontario had used selective audio and video that misrepresented the 1987 address and announcing it was reviewing legal options. The White House, for its part, framed Trump's explosion not as impulsive rage, but as a culmination of long pent-up frustration about Canada's entire strategy in trade talks. Whether that framing was accurate or convenient spin, it didn't matter. The talks were dead. Now here's where the analysis gets deeply layered, because what happened next revealed multiple political calculations happening simultaneously, and they don't all point in the same direction. Ford moved fast. Within hours, he announced Ontario would pause the ad campaign effective Monday so that trade talks could resume. But, and this is the crucial part, he made sure the ad ran through the weekend. It aired during Game 1 and Game 2 of the World Series, exactly as planned, reaching perhaps the largest audience it ever could have reached. And Ford framed the eventual pause as mission accomplished. "We've achieved our goal, having reached U.S. audiences at the highest levels. I've directed my team to keep putting our message in front of Americans over the weekend." He wasn't backing down. He was taking a victory lap while technically agreeing to stop. The ad had already done its work. Pulling it on Monday cost Ford nothing. The message had already landed in over 198 American markets, in millions of American living rooms, and during the most watched sporting event of the autumn. Carney, meanwhile, was already on a plane to Malaysia for an ASEAN summit when Trump's post hit. He said Canada stands ready to resume talks. He was measured, calm, and deliberately non-confrontational. He didn't match Trump's volume. He didn't fire back on social media. He boarded his plane and let the moment breathe. Then a week later, at the APEC summit in South Korea, he did something that surprised many observers. He apologized, and not through a spokesperson, directly to Trump. He told reporters he apologized because Trump was offended and that the ad was not something I would have done. He clarified he had told Ford directly that he didn't want the ad used. Trump, speaking aboard Air Force One, confirmed the exchange. He was very nice. He apologized for what they did with the commercial. Talks quietly began to inch back toward resumption. On the surface, that apology looks like a retreat, and in strict diplomatic optics, it was. But read the sequence more carefully and something else emerges. Because while Carney was apologizing for a television ad, he had already set in motion a structural realignment so significant that the apology barely registered against its scale. This is the part that genuinely left Washington speechless. The day before Trump's explosive Truth Social post, literally 24 hours earlier, Carney had announced publicly that Canada was formally committing to doubling its non-US exports within a decade. Not as an aspiration, not as a talking point, as a binding national strategy backed by real money and real policy. He had already signed a memorandum of understanding with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, a conservative critic of his, no less, to build a new oil pipeline through Western Canada capable of shipping as much as 400,000 barrels per day to Asian markets via British Columbia. The symbolism of that alone was enormous. Canada's most significant energy-producing province, governed by someone who had been one of Carney's sharpest political opponents, joining hands with Ottawa to redirect oil away from American refineries and toward Pacific markets. That is not a diplomatic signal, and that is a structural decision with generational consequences. And it didn't stop there. Carney launched a new $5 billion strategic response fund to help industries adapt and diversify. He announced reskilling packages for up to 50,000 workers. He introduced a formal Buy Canadian policy across all federal procurement. He announced new trade agreements with Ecuador and Indonesia. He restarted diplomatic talks with India after years of deep freeze following allegations around the killing of a Sikh leader in British Columbia. He traveled to South Korea, signing defense and industrial security pacts. He engaged Brussels, becoming a partner in the EU's Security Action for Europe program. At the G20 in Johannesburg, he was forging critical minerals agreements with South Africa and investment pathways with Vietnam. The Canadian government's own data confirmed by late 2025 that the US share of Canadian goods exports had fallen to 71.7%, down 4.2 percentage points from the previous year, the lowest share since the early 1980s, before Canada even had a free trade deal with the United States. At the Canadian Club in Toronto, Carney put it plainly. The decades-long process of ever closer economic relationship with the US is over. Our strengths of being tied to America are now our vulnerabilities. Our economic strategy is to change rapidly. He told business leaders Canada needed to build big, fast, and bold again. These were not the words of a man who had been caught off guard by Trump's tariffs. These were the words of a man who had already decided the old model was finished and was now executing a replacement. Now, let's be honest about what works and what doesn't in this strategy, because the picture is genuinely complicated and demands honest analysis. The strategic advantages are substantial. Canada's overexposure to a single trading partner has been one of the most glaring structural vulnerabilities in its economy for decades. Economists and trade experts had been flagging it for years. When more than 3/4 of your exports go to one buyer, and that buyer can unilaterally terminate negotiations over a television advertisement with zero notice, you don't have a trade relationship, you have a dependency. A dependency that any administration in Washington can weaponize whenever it chooses. The diversification strategy, if successfully executed over the medium to long term, transforms Canada's negotiating position fundamentally. It means Ottawa eventually returns to the table with Washington not from a position of desperation, but from a position of genuine alternatives. That is leverage, real leverage. The kind that actually changes outcomes. There's also the political dimension domestically. Polling by late 2025 showed most Canadians no longer viewed the United States as a trustworthy ally. Carney is reading that correctly. A Canadian Prime Minister who responds to American aggression by apologizing and waiting is a political liability. A Canadian Prime Minister who apologizes tactically while simultaneously building pipelines to Asia, signing deals in Seoul, and telling business leaders in Toronto that the old model is over, that is a Prime Minister who looks like he understands the moment. Carney's handling of this episode, whatever its imperfections, resonated with a Canadian public that had already emotionally moved on from the idea of the US as an unconditionally reliable partner. And the Reagan ad itself deserves a separate assessment, because the outrage about selective editing obscures what actually happened. Yes, Ontario rearranged clips from the 1987 address. Yes, the Reagan Foundation objected. But every word Reagan says in that ad is genuinely his. Every warning about trade barriers ultimately hurting workers, every prediction about markets shrinking and jobs disappearing, Reagan said all of it. The Foundation's decision to link to the full unabridged address in its protest statement backfired spectacularly, because the full speech makes the anti-tariff case even more powerfully than the edited version did. What Ford accomplished, and what Carney allowed to happen, because Carney saw the ad before it aired, was forcing tens of millions of American television viewers to hear one of the most beloved figures in Republican history make the argument that Trump's core economic policy destroys jobs and collapses markets. During the World Series, while the Supreme Court was weeks away from hearing arguments on whether those tariffs were even constitutionally valid, the timing was not accidental. None of this was accidental. But the disadvantages of Carney's broader strategy are real and require equally honest examination. 95% of Canada's energy exports still go to the United States. Over 90% of its lumber, aluminum, and steel. More than half of its agricultural products. With over half of Canada's agricultural products exported south of the border, and punishing tariffs already in place, 50% on steel, 45% on lumber, 25% on automobiles, the immediate pain being absorbed by Canadian workers and businesses is severe. Auto production dropped 5.4% in 2025 and is projected to keep declining. High-value manufactured goods have shed jobs as supply chains realign. Workers in Ontario's manufacturing communities, in Alberta's energy sector, in British Columbia's lumber industry, they are living through this restructuring in real time. The strategic vision may be sound. The 10-year timeline is not something a laid-off auto worker can eat. The engagement with China is the most complex and contested part of Carney's strategy. China offers the economic scale that no other alternative partner can match quickly enough to matter. Carney himself has framed Beijing as a more predictable partner than Washington in the current environment, a statement that reflects Ottawa's genuine frustration, but that has rattled security experts and Five Eyes partners. Michael Kovrig, the Canadian diplomat detained by China for over 1,000 days in what was widely seen as retaliatory hostage-taking, has specifically warned about getting closer to Beijing. China is a ruthless authoritarian regime that does not respect human life and treats it callously. The Hogue inquiry had already concluded that China was the most active perpetrator of foreign interference targeting Canadian democratic institutions. Carney's willingness to deepen trade engagement with Beijing, while simultaneously putting Canada's F-35 fighter jet contract under review and distancing from American defense procurement, it raises serious questions about the long-term security implications of this pivot that go well beyond trade spreadsheets. Then there is the apology itself. Was it necessary? Politically, probably yes. The alternative, open confrontation with Trump while still needing to negotiate tariff relief on billions of dollars in daily cross-border trade, was worse than swallowing some pride. But the pattern it reinforces is concerning. Trump provokes. Canada absorbs. Canada makes a counter-move. Trump escalates. Canada apologizes. Talks resume on Washington's terms. That cycle, if it becomes the established rhythm, gives Trump enormous behavioral reinforcement for using trade negotiations as a constant pressure mechanism. Every time the tactic works, every time the other side walks back, apologizes, pulls the ad, it validates the approach for the next round. Carney's apology was tactically justified. Strategically, and it risked setting a precedent that will complicate every future negotiation. And the USMCA renegotiation is looming. Mexico has already moved ahead of Canada as America's top trading partner, and its president has been more effective at securing targeted exemptions from Trump's tariff regime. Canada enters that renegotiation in a structurally weaker position than it would like, with significant tariffs already in place on sectors not covered by the existing agreement and with a relationship that has been repeatedly disrupted. The Ontario ad episode will not be forgotten in Washington when those negotiations begin. Trump has a long memory for perceived slights, and Canada has given him several. But step all the way back, past the ad, past the apology, past the truth social explosion, past the World Series optics, and look at what this entire episode actually represents in the larger picture of 21st century geopolitics. We are watching in real time the unraveling of an economic architecture that took more than a century to build. The Canada-US trade relationship, one of the world's most closely integrated, processing nearly $1.3 trillion in annual trade, is being disrupted not by war, not by ideology, not by any of the forces that historically restructure global commerce. It is being disrupted by one man's mood on a Thursday night and his access to a social media platform. When that is the fragility of the system, when a 60-second television ad can terminate negotiations that took months to construct, then the foundation itself is already compromised. Canada didn't break the relationship. The relationship broke, and now Carney is deciding what to build in its place. His answer: diversify rapidly, signal credible alternatives, maintain the diplomatic window without depending on it, and force Washington to reckon with the possibility that Canada has real options, is the most strategically coherent response available to a smaller nation facing a more powerful and unpredictable neighbor. It is not painless. It is not fast. It carries genuine risks, particularly around China and the domestic economic disruption of restructuring. But the alternative? Passive absorption, endless accommodation, perpetual negotiation from a position of dependency has demonstrably stopped working. Trump's Washington has no incentive to offer Canada a fair deal if Canada has no credible alternatives. What Carney appears to understand, and what Washington is slowly realizing, is that Canada is no longer simply waiting. It's building. The trips to Asia, the deals in South Africa, the pipeline MOU with Alberta, the EU defense partnership, the reskilling funds, the diversification targets, these are not press release gestures. They are the architecture of a Canada that intends, over time, to make its relationship with the United States one of preference rather than necessity. That transformation, if it succeeds, will be one of the most consequential economic pivots by a G7 nation in modern history. A 60-second television ad started it. But what Mark Carney is building in response is something Washington never expected, and is only now beginning to take seriously.